Hey, how's it going? It's John Fitzpatrick. I'm privileged to be the executive director of Educate Texas. Um, Welcome to the Educate Texas Philanthropy Advocates sort of fall 2020 preview and exciting 2021 policy session. I'm sad not to be with all of you in person. This is one of my favorite events of the year, and it's not the same doing it on Zoom, but we have done our best, and it's going to be a really good 2 days. So just as a reminder for some of you, Philanthropy Advocates used to be called TGAC, the Texas Education Grantmakers Advocacy Consortium. TGAC and Educate Texas came together almost 2 years ago. I said at the time that I hoped it would be like peanut butter and chocolate, good separately, even better together. I think that's turned out. And you'll really get to experience that today, as we work through school funding, early literacy, effective teaching, and pathways to college and career. One person who couldn't be with us today is the chair of Philanthropy Advocates, Dr. Win Rosser, who's the CEO of TLL Temple in East Texas. Great guy. Win had some connectivity issues. He's out of state, and just sending him our best. Couple housekeeping issues. We're covering a lot of ground in the next 90 minutes. So the bios for the speakers, are sort of embedded in the materials you've gotten. So we're gonna be introducing really quickly. Second is we're gonna sort all of you good folks on the call by your names into the different breakout rooms on the second half of this call. So if you can actually put your full name in your little Zoom screen, it'll help us make sure that you get into the right group. And my colleague Becky Callahan has put the bios in the chat box. So again, just very appreciative, at Educate Texas and Philanthropy Advocates, we're trying to think bigger about state policy in Texas. We're trying to do it based on the best available data and research, which you're going to hear a lot about today. And third, we really strive to have a big tent and not to have all the same people that think the same way, but try to bring across both the political spectrum and across different points of opinions, about these areas, and try to come to some, pointed recommendations led by some of our great chairs that you're going to hear from. But that's our MO. And with that, let me turn it over to one of our leaders, my colleague, Priscilla Aquina Garza, who leads our K-12 and policy work. Take it away, Priscilla.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, John. Well, it's good to see your names and some of your faces. I hope that everyone is keeping in good spirits in these tumultuous times. I always say I have 2 children, and I'm sure they will make an appearance at some point, which is why I have my fake background here. But know that we understand, and we welcome the sightings of the loved ones in your homes. So thank you for being with us today. I just big picture want to discuss, and I've had the privilege of meeting and working with many of you through the years, but just as a reminder, what kind of policy and advocacy work we do as a team of 5 really at this point, thank goodness, is really trying to leverage the spaces for both collaboration and bringing together people that have diverse backgrounds that don't always get to speak with each other, to really try and do what's best for students in Texas. And I always like to ground us in that, because we don't have a client. Our client are the children, wanting to make sure that they are getting the best education possible. And our policy work before we were 5 was committed to K-12 and higher ed, which is why when Jennifer and Becky came over, it made perfect sense that we could keep working together very seamlessly. Our work continues to be focused on higher education, college and career readiness, and effective teaching, which is a lot of the work that you all in Philanthropy Advocates had done through the years, and that we had coordinated with. So I just wanted to remind and ground us in that shared identity and care for our communities. our work is about educating and building the dialogue and making sure we're giving people resources and understanding of what are the challenges that we most face in these spaces. And so we do that through a lot of our convene groups, which many of you, we have the privilege of joining when we do those groups. And so we have the Texas Student Success Council, which has been a higher ed facing convene group. We have the Teaching and Learning Council, which is a K-12 facing group that we convened for the first time this past year. And then the work of Philanthropy Advocates, which really pulls together the philanthropy voice in particular in the space. And so I just want to say that that's really what we do together. And we try to make sure that we're getting good information out there, that we're elevating the voices of what it means to bring the different pieces of our educational ecosystem together, as well, to make sure that we're serving our students as best we can. When we do this work, I always say it sounds really quick in a quick introduction, but it takes a year at least, if not more, to pull all that work together. We bring together people from all the different sectors, and so what that means is everyone has a different entry point and a leverage that they've been using over the years, and how we actually marry those, I think, is the strength and our niche as an organization, is really trying to make sure that we're all listening to each other and understanding that, K-12 and higher ed have to learn from each other, and workforce and higher ed and K-12 needs to work from each other. And philanthropy plays a role in all of that too. And so we just really try to bridge those silos that unfortunately we often see in our different spaces. And so we thank and are so grateful for those of you that come along the journey with us, that last at least a year, sometimes more, many meetings, and even more so because of the pandemic. We just really had to shift everything in a way that we hadn't done previously. So it takes about a year for us to come up with recommendations. Later today, you'll hear from two of our chairs who are leading that work for us, and you'll get a better sense of where they're headed. I will tell you, we're still drafting final language. We have the final ideas, but what you see today is still going to shift just a smidgen as we make sure we tighten our language and make it as clear as possible as we enter the legislative session era. And so we'll spend the rest of the fall trying to connect with staffers. So those of you that are on the line, hi, you'll hear from us again soon. But we thank you and hope that we can be partners as we try to make sure that the next legislative session continues to high hopes for our education space for our children. And I will stop there. I know that we have, I'm ahead 2 minutes, so Jen will be happy to hear that. But I feel like giving you the broader pieces. You will have more documents from us forthcoming than maybe you want, but any of those questions, if you read something today, you hear something today, you want more, please feel free to reach out to any of us. But I've been leading those two groups in particular around higher ed and K-12, and happy to provide any answers I can, and also to get any feedback that you might have. So I will turn it over back to Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you, Priscilla. That's fantastic. That was a great overview. I mean, the only thing I will add here is, first of all, Priscilla and I will be moderating this very large panel that we have to show you here in a couple of minutes. And just to connect the dots, because we wanted you to hear from the people who are actually doing a lot of this heavy lifting. The work that we have engaged in through Philanthropy Advocates, which we call our policy work groups, is only because the folks in this meeting have invested in this work. So right after a legislative session, we go back to our members and we say, okay, let's do this again. We got another 2-year cycle coming up. What are the issues you want to work on? And as Priscilla said, the issues that you see on the screen are the issues we've been involved in since day one. That hasn't changed. And then we ask our members to invest in those issue areas, those work groups, and then we're able to pass through those dollars to fund the research and the advocacy related to those issues. So a lot of the folks that you're going to hear from on this Zoom webinar today are either our lead grantees doing research, our lead grantees doing advocacy, or, as Priscilla said, the chairs of the councils that Educate Texas convenes over this entire 2-year cycle. So that's just to clarify kind of who you're going to hear from and why. And with that, I guess the last thing I'll say is we couldn't do this without all of you. When we talk about advocacy, there's no way to do effective advocacy in a silo. It only happens because of all of the people that are involved, whether you're investors, whether you're advocates. We want to be a resource and a thought partner to lawmakers. We want to be helpful to staffers. So for those of you who are on the phone who are staffers, we are here to be of service to you. With that, I want to turn it over to the real stars of this session. And we're going to start with the issue of school funding. And we're going to start with Nelda Hunter, who is at Hilco Partners. And Nelda has a ton of experience in budgets and all things money and tax and education funding, K-12, higher ed. We're going to start with Nelda. She's going to give us paint some broad brushes at the highest levels of what we're dealing with as we look toward 21. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Roland Hernandez, who's the superintendent of Corpus, who's actually living and breathing this stuff on the ground every day. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nelda.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm super happy to be here. And what I'm going to do is just what Jen indicated. I'm going to give a super high level overview of where we are with the budget and what got us to this point. If we start on the next slide, you'll see some current budget drivers. And we all know what's happening now in our economy, because of the pandemic, but actually our troubles started earlier this year, or even before that, with the oil and gas markets. There was a lot of turmoil there, and prices fell dramatically. And so that happened first. It seems like this year's been going on forever. It hasn't, but it definitely feels like it. In March is actually when the pandemic started. And as you recall, there was a reopening and then a closing again. It's just thrown everything our economy into disarray. And what that led to is in June, the governor's office instructing the agencies to propose 5% reductions, which they did. And although there was never any official approval of the proposals, most agencies went ahead with that anyway. And so some of us are seeing the impact of those. I did want to give you a visual. If you go to the next slide, this is from the comptroller's office. It's a graph that indicates, and I don't think y'all can see it right now, but basically it's just a graph of the tax collections from month to month. And you can really see the decline in all of the tax collections. Where we aren't seeing as dramatic of a decline is in sales taxes. And that's thanks to, the bill that was passed last session related to online sales, tax collections. And so we're actually seeing those rebound a little bit. It'll be interesting to see if that holds over the next year or so. If we go to the next slide, I'll talk about kind of where we are with budget development. If you recall, last summer, before after session, the comptroller issued he basically told us that we were going to have $3 billion surplus at the end of session. And in July, he issued a revised estimate, which indicates that we'll have at least a $4.6 billion shortfall. And that will have to be addressed in 2021 with a supplemental. And that shortfall can vary. It can go up, it can go down, mainly, related to incoming tax revenues, but also, Medicaid, the Medicaid shortfall really drives that shortfall number most of the time. It will also have, be impacted by federal aid. Right now, we've been the recipient of CARES Act funding. I think there's a lot of hope out there that the federal government will push more our way, but we just don't know. So those are some big uncertain topics right now. Besides the reduction strategy, the legislature does have a pretty robust economic stabilization fund to tap. It's estimated to have almost $9 billion in the fund at the end of this 2021. Agencies also started submitting their legislative appropriations requests. And, most of them are in. I know TEAs is in, HHSC's was actually loaded at some point. I was there this morning. I had checked a few times yesterday, so that's also in. And so we can review those and see what the agencies are planning going forward. But, most of all, I guess what we have to deal with is just uncertainty. We have new House leadership coming on the way, potentially new party leadership. And the continuation of the federal public health emergency. And on the last slide, these are just some big questions that the legislature is going to have to answer. And these aren't all, but these are some of the big ones. how will they ensure the continued financial support of reforms of House Bill 3? How will the state provide financial support to public schools related to the pandemic? And, what does that look like with, what the schools are facing now? And Dr. Hernandez could probably talk about that. Will they consider any bills related to new revenue, tax changes, gaming, gambling, all the ideas? Will all of those be on the table? Will they be considered? And if there isn't any new revenue that is considered, new revenue sources considered, what services will the legislature choose to reduce? That's a big question. We have to see if the federal government provides any relief, either through an extension of the CARES Act money, flexibility related to that money to allow us to plug, the budget holes. Another big question is if the state will expand healthcare coverage. And that's been, it's been in the news a lot lately on both sides of the aisle. So that's interesting this time around. And then the last one I kind of listed is just, it's been a big one that doesn't get a lot of attention. It's the obligations for TRS and ERS. The legislature made some decisions related to TRS last time. They didn't for ERS, and so that obligation continues to grow, and it puts the state in an interesting position going forward. I don't want to leave too much time, but I think I'm a little bit over, and so I'll kick it to Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you, Nelda, and thank you all for the opportunity to just share with you a little bit of what we're facing out in the school systems across the state. Not only am I fortunate to just be superintendent of Corpus Christi ISD, but I'm also fortunate to be a part of the Texas School Alliance, serving as their chair this year and working with 42 of the best superintendents in the state, and also hearing what their challenges are. Right now it's just a different world for everybody, obviously. And what we're having severe challenges with is just finding the number of students that we had when all this started. We leave for spring break, we don't really get to come back, don't see them. And now, as you see across the state, the approach of virtual learning, face-to-face learning, hybrid models, you name it. Fortunately, over the course of the year in districts starting at different times, we have been able to slowly start transitioning back to school. In Corpus Christi, we have a very high number of students who have not returned to school yet, either face-to-face or have even registered. So the first topic I'd like to talk about on funding, which we'll discuss even more so in the breakout, but Nelda's last slide really had some great questions that, as superintendents, are the exact questions that we'll want to know more about moving forward. First is the hold harmless that's in place for this current school year. We've had a few weeks to work with that so that districts aren't really penalized too much for decreased enrollment or decreased average daily attendance. And that is something that is a challenge to all school districts across the state. But the issue there is that it has been extended for just short increments at a time. What we would really like to see and really need to have happen, just so that we can focus more on other areas, is to have that hold harmless extended through the entire school year of the 2021 school year. That would do wonders for all school districts. Additionally, a lot of state comp funding and funding that districts receive, regardless of size and enrollment, is their free and reduced lunch applications from their families and students. So you can only imagine if that's a tough challenge during a regular school year, now that half of these families aren't being found, students are all over the place, whether they're in your city, other districts, have left the state. That's very important for school districts to get that submitted, because it impacts accountability, it impacts school funding. And in this case, we've had a deadline of the first semester, this fall semester. What districts really need to see have happen to work with us is to just go ahead and extend that into the spring semester, into 2021. Additionally, what was mentioned in the last slide also with House Bill 3, built into that House Bill 3 was half-day funding. What we'd like to see with funding there is to go ahead and just move that to full-day funding instead of the half-day, to help the districts during this challenging time. And then, of course, with the number of students who aren't engaged in the face-to-face, some doing the virtual learning, but many not in school settings, period, this is this is going to be a serious learning slide, which we normally encounter in a regular summer, but students have not been in school since March during the spring break, and then into the summer, and even now, we're finding that students are very, very behind where they normally would be at this time of the school year. So I think that those funding mechanisms that schools have had continue to be very challenging for all school districts, regardless of size. Just for example, in Corpus Christi ISD, to this point in the school year, and we have students who are learning virtually, and we have students that are face-to-face. We are running a hybrid schedule for our high schools, but we're down about 1,800 students on enrollment. And our average daily attendance with attendance is down from normally 94, 95% to under 90, right at 89%. And so as we apply numbers and calculations to these situations that we're dealing with, just that alone with the decreased enrollment and the decreased average daily attendance is going to impact us at $15.5 million in lost funding for just CCISD. And, we're in a situation that bigger districts, we have about 37,000 students in Corpus Christi ISD, but other districts who are larger, if we're experiencing or stand to experience a $15.5 million loss, then you can only imagine what that number is going to be for these larger districts. The other thing too, as we move forward, may come out in the breakout session is because of that learning slide, we're going to have many, many special groups, special populations need additional interventions to help them succeed. And we do everything possible that we can, from extended day to Saturday schools, just to help get them that academic support that these students are going to need. And so is that additional funding going to be there to help those special populations? And then something else that we're running to on top of the pandemic is just kind of a random expansion of charter schools, which we know that the more and more charter schools come about, the funding just continues to be taken away from your traditional schools, which makes it even more challenging. So those are just some of the things that we're dealing with. We certainly don't want to get to a point of where we're going to have to be laying off our own employees to keep up with funding challenges and crisis, but I don't want to take up all the time. We'll save that for the breakout group.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. That was great. Yes, let's continue that conversation in the breakout. We know that your breakout is going to be a really popular one. Okay, we're going to move on to our early literacy work group. So again, just to remind you guys, for those funders on the Zoom call who have been funding this work group, we work very, very closely with Texans Care for Children, who's our lead research grantee, and they also happen to be amazing advocates focused on English learners and early literacy for English learners. We've been focused on early literacy since our inception, and we made a lot of progress on the pre-K front, but we have a lot more work to do around early literacy. You heard Secretary Spellings talk about that today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Fagan, who heads up the policy shop for Texans Care. David?
Thank you, Jen, and thank you everybody for joining us virtually today. I'm so excited to talk to you all about what we were able to accomplish in regards to early literacy and English learners since January of this year, which, as mentioned earlier, feels like an eternity ago. But big thanks to everybody who's on the phone from the early literacy work group, from the team at Philanthropy Advocates, to all of my partners in crime who are on our steering committee who are on this call. And so, Becky, you can go to the next slide. I'll just dive into some of the basics of what we did and why. Becky, if you can go back a couple slides. Yeah, thanks. Basically, as Jen mentioned, we had a very successful session in 2019, unprecedented, historic investment in early literacy, from supporting full-day pre-K funding to new heightened standards around early literacy, all about making children strong readers by third grade. For our next step, we realized that for HB3 to be successful, for Texas to be successful, we really needed to provide a much brighter spotlight on our English learner students, those children, in birth through 8 who maybe their parents speak a different language at home. They're coming into English for the first time, and are emergent bilingual with the right supports. So if you go to the next slide, you know, if I had to sum up, you know, this initiative in 2 sentences and why we are doing it, it would be this, that early childhood is key to English learner success, and English learners are key to the state's success. You know, we know that early childhood experiences in the home, at childcare, pre-K, and the early grades provides the foundation for educational success. We know that for language acquisition, when you're trying to learn 2 languages, when the brain is most ready to absorb that information, the early childhood years are key. And with 1 in 4 Texas students being classified as an English learner, the highest percentage in the nation, we know that the state's success depends on how we support those English learners. So on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how we tried to make the project a success. We understood very quickly that we needed to look under the hood of our educational system to go at this right. We understood that we needed to take a real deep dive, and that included research and data collection. It required a survey of 185 stakeholders and early childhood experts, spotlight interviews of different experts. All that's leading us to the policy agenda we're putting together now. And it was only possible with the steering committee we put together that included IDRA, and Dr. Chloe Latham-Sykes and Anna Ramon, who are on today, Kim Coffrin from the Texas Association for the Education of Young Children, who I believe is on today, and Dr. Dina Castro from the University of North Texas at Denton. So that steering committee helped us make these things happen. And if you go to the next slide, you know, we found quite a lot through this project that won't fit on one slide, but I think these are the main themes that really came to light. That first, even with the progress of House Bill 3, we need to do more to fund the real cost of quality for bilingual education and for young English learners. And we also learned that even with new improvements, we need a more intentional focus on the standards and guidance that districts get to make sure that any English learner, regardless of what zip code they live in, has access to a quality learning environment. You know, that learning environment includes quality dual language immersion programs that HB3 provided more funding for. But we know that, you know, among English learners in pre-K through 3rd grade, only around 18% are in dual language programs. So we know we have a lot more to do there. And our educators, you know, which I know the Effective Teaching Group will talk about this some, but our educators need better support. We need more certified bilingual educators. We need a stronger focus on how to provide a linguistically and culturally responsive learning environment. And we need the data to understand what's working well. So on the next slide, you know, I'll talk a little bit about you know, how coronavirus and COVID-19 has impacted our English learners. Becky, you can go to the next slide. So COVID-19 has hit our English learners hard. You know, Dr. Hernandez touched on this earlier, but the COVID slide is really impacting our young English learners. You know, TEA found that they were less engaged in distance learning. And we know that for language development to succeed, you know, we need access to in-person enriching education for you know, children to really capture that early childhood window and really take advantage. So we know the impacts of the COVID slide will last for years, and that we have a lot of work to do to undo it. And the urgency of this was certainly enhanced by COVID-19. So if you go to the next slide, one after that. So these were sort of the main policy considerations that came out of the project. The initiative is putting together a policy roadmap that includes nearly 40 recommendations focused on how we do this. So we touch on workforce, program quality, school finance, English learners with disabilities and delays, and we can certainly talk about this a little bit more in the breakout room. So I think the next one is the final slide. And like I said, a lot more to come from this initiative. We'll have a dedicated website that will touch on all this. And yeah, I look forward to talking about this a little bit more in our breakout room, and I'll pass things over back to Jen.
Thanks, David. This, I was just going to mention one thing before I pass it to Priscilla. This was actually highlighted in a national early childhood funders collaborative I think 2 weeks ago. So there is national interest for the work we're doing here in Texas, thanks to all of you. So with that, I'll pass it over to Priscilla.
Great, and I will take a second just to, introduce Dr. David Anthony, who many of you know from his various roles as a superintendent Sci-Fair, ISD, but also as CEO of Raise Your Hand Texas, and he has chaired our Teaching and Learning Council this past year, and so I will let him tell you a little bit about some of the things that the council has come up with, and I'll let him take it.
Thank you, Priscilla. So an awful lot to get to in 5 minutes, so I want to go ahead and get started. During the last year, the Teaching and Learning Council has convened to develop recommendations intended to improve educational outcomes for more than 5 million students, with an emphasis on addressing education inequities that predominantly affect students of color, students with disabilities, English language learners, and students from low-income families. We offer recommendations for promoting systemic equity in education, investing wisely in the school system, and building capacity and promoting quality within the teaching profession, with the ultimate goal of improving outcomes for students, our only clients, so that they can be successful in school, the workforce, and life. Now, if you'll see, look at the screen there, I think it's really important because we have a few members from all over the spectrum of education support groups, and we have one unified voice, and that is the goal of what we're trying to do. Our goal is to help place a high-quality teacher in every classroom, the most important factor in a child's education. We also expect to identify and research solutions, not dwell on problems, excuses, or blame. We simply want to identify how we can help improve the educational experience for all students. We aspire to engage with the decision makers, legislators, and regulators, the Texas Education Agency, State Board of Education, State Board for Educator Certification, as informed resources regarding critical issues in Texas public education. The Teaching and Learning Council is made up of a very diverse group of ideators from every segment of the education and support community. There's incredible intellectual and experiential capital at work on the council. We were making great progress in the winter of 2020 until the interloper, COVID-19, entered the mix. Life changed, the needs of our students and educators changed too. Actually, they have the same needs, but there are some additional needs that have always been secondary, that have been zoomed into a priority mode. Our virtual meetings also identified several new factors that impact the quality of instruction in Texas. Next slide, please. And mental and emotional health and wellness was a factor before. Well, I mean, it was a focus for many school districts, but it's certainly become a key factor for students and teachers in 2020. We identified several things in Texas in which Texas was deficient, even with one of the greatest economies in the world. In our state, school districts didn't have the same equal equity or equality in broadband connectivity for virtual education. And as Dr. Hernandez said, some kids aren't even involved and enrolled, engaged in virtual or face-to-face, some of them simply because they don't have the infrastructure. Next slide. Funding HB3, and I know funding is going to be covered in a breakout group, and a lot has already been said about it, but there were some innovations, and Educate Texas was very engaged as informed witnesses and supporters for HB3 during the session. But the teacher incentive allotments, mentoring, additional days, additional school year days for part of the kids, but we really need that now more than ever for every student in order to catch up on what has been lost. And funding schools based on attendance during a pandemic, whether face-to-face or virtually, poses problems and creates even more angst for our administrators and educators who are trying to deal with this issue. And then we need to identify and adopt virtual teaching standards with micro-credentials. We need to do a better job. We were doing a spotty job, a good job in places and not so well in others before the pandemic, but now virtual education is a reality for all of us. Next slide. So as you look, we need to strengthen and invest the teaching profession. And that's been one of the goals to to bring in more teachers, to bring in a more diverse teaching population, and to do the best job possible in getting them through to and successful in the schoolhouse workplace. We have to improve the equity and diversity. We have to improve how we deal with getting teachers and keeping them. So we want to review and revise also our expectations and standards so that pertain to effective pedagogical skills for beginning teachers. Next slide, please. Is that it? Yeah. And so there's a lot to be said, and I'm not sure I did quite do justice, but as you can see, our policy recommendations and our TLC members were nimble, adaptable, compassionate, and realistic. We listened to their input and pivoted from just EPP improvements and high quality teachers and added issues critical to our students. So thank you for being a part of this great gathering of engaged, committed advocates. I am going to turn it over now to Kevin Melanson. Kevin is the Executive Director of Teach Plus Texas.
Thank you, David. I know for sure now that you're from Louisiana by the way you said that name. I like that. It makes me feel right at home. My name is Kevin Melanson. I'm the Executive Director of Teach Plus Texas, and we're excited to be a lead research and advocacy grantee this year with Philanthropy Advocates. Without your support, we wouldn't be able to do some of this really important and necessary work that we're able to do. So I want to talk a little bit about our fellowship and then talk in depth about our work this year and some of our recommendations. As you know, we're a teacher leadership organization, and we work with diverse, effective, and engaged fellows from around the state of Texas. This year we have 50 fellows that make up two cohorts of teachers, and these teachers are going to be engaged. We've actually started some teacher-led research on the two areas that you see here. So we will be ultimately completing this research in the next couple of months and creating 2 work products. And those are listed here on the slide. The first will be around teacher preparation. We're looking at what are the key components of an effective teacher clinical experience, and then even more so what competencies are most effective or efficient for candidates to develop while they're in their educator prep program. The second piece of work is around the effects of COVID-19. Teach Plus National did some work this summer, and Teach Plus Texas, we want to take another snapshot of the effects of COVID and where teachers expect to see education go now that they have rejoined the students in the schoolhouse. So our strategy is our tried and true strategy to work with our teachers, as well as this year, I'm excited to say we're going to be working with 3 advocacy sub-grantees who are some of those folks who are on the call, Leadership ISD, Deans for Impact, and Ed Trust. I'm really excited to work alongside these folks. And we'll be using our tried and true testimonies of getting teachers in front of the folks that they need to be in front of to tell the stories of themselves and their students to try to make impact for themselves and their students. You go to the next slide, Becky. So Teach Plus was a part of the Teaching and Learning Council. And so you're going to see a lot of synergy in what we expect to come from our research and the work that those folks did earlier this year. But most importantly, I mentioned at the top, Teach Plus is a teacher leadership organization. So first off, we expect to see and we believe that it's important to embrace teacher leadership and include teachers in all the decision-making processes. Already there's been a lot of decisions made to get us back into the classroom and to whatever kind of normal that we're seeing in schools now. And teachers want to continue to be engaged in those conversations and have stake in what happens to them and their students. Next, to really incorporate the expertise of teachers in school planning and instruction, right? So not just what happens inside the classroom, but what happens outside the classroom. These are our experts. They need to be on the front lines helping make these decisions. And like we saw before from the teaching and learning recommendations, increase resources for trauma-informed instruction, student mental health, and the well-being of teachers. A lot of my work is talking to teachers every day, and these are topics that are constantly coming up. We've got to come together to make sure we can support those those teachers so that we can be there, so that they can be there to support the students. Next slide. And Priscilla, I see you. I will definitely knock it out within 2 minutes. This slide also has some familiar themes, strengthen communications and partnership with parents and families to better support students. If the new normal involves a high degree or high percentage of blended learning or at-home learning or e-learning, then communication between parents and students is parents and teachers is gonna be key. So we wanna highlight that. Next, identify, evaluate, and scale up promising practices. This is all about innovation, folks. Now is an inflection point in education, and if we don't take the opportunity to make some much needed innovations, I think we will have missed an opportunity. Of course, teachers want to be involved in making those decisions. And finally, prioritize education funding with a lens towards equity. Teach Plus was a big proponent of House Bill 3. We did a lot of work to advance those strategic allotments that we believe advance equity. And we think that that package needs to stay whole in this upcoming session. And if there are cuts made, we don't believe they need to be made in education. 2 minutes, back at you.
You got it. I appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am.
I know that I've been pronouncing your name improperly, so I apologize. These are our learning opportunities. I want to take the moment to introduce Dr. Hallmark, who also is graciously served with us as one of the chairs for our Texas Student Success Council. He's the Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs at the Texas A&M University System. So I will turn it over to him.
Thank you, Priscilla, and I ask that you stay on this slide here for the next moment because I want to say something about the Success Council and the way that we've gone about our work in the past year and a half. So the Success Council consists of a great collection of individuals from different groups. For example, there's people from the community college sector, from the public schools, from universities, from workforce, we have affiliates from other kinds of entities such as members and staffers from the House and Senate. So there's different perspectives that come together. And what we did is we got together about a year and a half ago and decided these are the focus groups that we will have over the coming year and a half. And it is the linkage from the K-12 environment up into higher ed. And it is how the portability of credits is working or not working within higher ed. And that means being able to move from one entity to another and have your credits transfer and apply to your degree. And then the third component is that transition from the higher ed environment into the workforce. And so on the basis of that discussion, we came up with a number of recommendations and things that we would be wanting to pursue in terms of advocacy in the coming legislative session. And in the process of massaging that and working through what those might be, we refined it to what you're about to see. And now I'll ask that you move on to the next slide. And that first slide is the priority recommendations for the Texas Student Success Council. The first one has to do with broadband internet connectivity and access to that. And you see that in others' recommendations today. I've already seen it and heard it discussed this afternoon. But the basic idea, we already knew that there was a digital divide in Texas. And of course, COVID exacerbated the challenges associated with that digital divide. And it's not just the availability of that broadband connectivity, but also access to it. And so one of our recommendations is to make a one-time investment for the rainy day fund in order to address that connectivity and access. The second overriding priority recommendation addresses the importance of work-based learning, youth apprenticeships, competency-based education credit for prior learning. So this is kind of an innovation section, or at least a let's keep moving forward section, where there are so many valuable opportunities associated with this kind of learning. And we want to create an environment, we want to foster and encourage an environment where that is central to what we are doing in terms of preparing individuals for their lifelong profession or career as they move from one stage to another. The third of the priority recommendations has to do with data sharing. And this is one that permeates a good bit of our discussion in all of the different groups from the Texas Student Success Council. In that Texas is very rich in data and very poor in using that data or having that data accessible to entities who are able to massage it, use it, and make better choices and decisions in terms of how we may better serve our residents and citizens. And so wanting to access that information, wanting to be able to use that information in a way that is different from what it is now. So those are the 3 priority recommendations the Success Council has settled in on. And then if you go to the next slide, I'll highlight a couple of things in the following, I believe, 3 slides, which are somewhat connected and somewhat not with those 3 priority recommendations. As you look at these recommendations on this slide from the K-12 higher ed workforce data alignment perspective, you see things such as data alignment, the transfer of credits, promoting data use. And so these priority recommendations are embedded within these particular recommendations. If you go to the next slide, from the college and career access and success perspective, there's a grant making recommendation that we need to improve the coordination of the grant making amongst the tri-agencies, focused on work-based learning initiatives, technical assistance, and regional intermediary development. And so again, it's a coordination piece that we believe would be essential in improving what we're doing. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide because I'm already at like 15 seconds left on my 5 minutes according to my stopwatch. But the last slide is about innovation. And these are recommendations associated with competency-based learning and credit for prior learning, a wonderful means by which we can get more Texans with greater credentials in order to better serve our state and for them to serve their families. And then the final recommendation there is continued rigor and increased student access to dual credit early college, high school, and P-TECH programs. Again, it's a piece of how do we better transition those students from the education environment into the workforce. And with that, I believe Jacob is next.
He is, and if I may, Jacob Friday, which I think needs no introduction, but President and CEO of the Texas Association of Community Colleges, and also a grantee from our Philanthropy Advocates, and a member of the Student Success Council. So thank you, Jacob, for being here today.
Thank you, Priscilla, and good day, colleagues, friends. Good to see all of you. So I'm going to cover a lot of ground, perhaps provide a 5-minute case study of what one association is doing for a sector of institutions as we get ready for the 2021 session. And before I dive into this particular slide, let me just say at the onset that this is a process. And for our colleges, we started as way back as July of 2019, which was only 16 months ago, but in pandemic terms, that was about 5 years ago. But so, it took us that long to get to an agreement on what are our policy priorities. But I wanted to sort of call that out because I think the process is important. And then going into the session, we really have sort of 2 pillars that we're going to be anchoring our strategy. One is that we need to channel the student voice. And I'll talk a minute about a survey that we did of students. And then secondly, that it is our intent that we need to ensure post-secondary education and training opportunities for all Texans in all communities. And I'll talk more about what I mean by that in a second. So at the onset of the pandemic back in April, we surveyed students in real time to get from them feedback on what were the pain points as they were transitioning full-time to online learning. And what students told us, and I think it was like something like 45% of the students who responded told us that they were likely to delay the graduation. And another 30% of students told us that they were likely to take less classes in the summer and fall terms. And lo and behold, as we now are counting the enrollments for this fall, at least in Texas community colleges, we are projecting that we will probably end the fall with about a 9.5% reduction in student enrollment. So what the students told us back in April is in fact materializing here this fall. Working with philanthropy advocates, we intend this fall to survey students again, not just community college students, but this time also include some university students, and then survey them this fall to essentially ask what were the decisions that they made and how were the decisions affected by the pandemic. And so we look forward to presenting that information to philanthropy advocates and then sharing it with Dr. Hallmark and all of our other colleagues, because I think it's important for all of us as we get ready for 2021 to think of the student's perspective in mind. Now to this slide. There's 2 things that I would call out on this slide, not just that the funding mechanism is the North Star for community colleges, and it is, but really a point on process. So colleagues, going way, way, way back to January of 2020, when we all expected that the 2021 session was going to be a higher education session, when we all expected there might actually be a surplus, let alone the economic stabilization fund that Nelda talked about earlier. Way back then, we were thinking that we might actually be so bold as to request a 10% increase in formula funding for community colleges. What you see in front of you is actually a base level funding. We are now submitted to the legislature that we get in the next biennia at least as much as we got in the biennia. But I want to call out one particular element in here because this gets to my second pillar of making sure that all Texans are served. We are recommending that the legislature move some funds, and you see it there in the chart. It's $32 million from the contact hour bucket, which is our traditional funding based on enrollment, and then put it into core operating funds. To be clear, that means that my smaller colleges and my medium-sized colleges that are not realizing any growth in enrollment and not likely to realize enrollment growth, frankly, that they will benefit largely by this move. I share that with you because our philosophy going into the session certainly is that the state needs to invest in community colleges because we do enroll 46% of all students in higher education, because we do enroll 92% of all high school students who are taking dual credit courses, because we do enroll 93% of all students who are enrolled in CTE courses. But we're doing it in a way that ensures that all communities have access to education. So I'll pause there because I know we can have those discussions in the break room, but good to see all of you.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you to all of our panelists. That was great. I know it's not enough time. I know it's a lot of content, but as you can see, we've been really, really busy over many months trying to get these policy recommendations in tip-top shape. And what you will see coming out of Educate Texas and Philanthropy Advocates is essentially a compilation of all of these policy recommendations boiled down into a document that we can share with lawmakers as we get closer to the session. With that, we have some time to dig into some of these issues, and we're gonna start going into our breakout sessions. If you don't like where you are, you can come back to the main room and be reassigned somewhere else. This is always sort of a grand experiment for us, but we will come back at 3:20 and have some closing remarks from Elfrida Norman, who is here from Community Foundation of Texas, and then we'll talk about Friday. So with that, let's break out. Like magic, isn't it amazing? Welcome back, everybody. I hope you guys had some good conversation. We are almost at time, so I'm going to turn it over to my boss, John Fitzpatrick, so he can introduce our last two speakers.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to introduce Elfrida Norman, my board chair. She oversees the Dallas Federal Reserve. Their focus on communications, public outreach, economic growth, and underserved communities. And again, as a reminder, we've got her bio both on the website and in the chat room. On a personal note, Elfrida is the chair of the full board of Community Foundation of Texas. She was my board chair for the Educate Texas Governance Committee for a couple of years. And she's smart, particularly on things like workforce development and economic mobility. She's passionate about first generation students, in K-12 and college. And I would say this year in particular, since the George Floyd killing and a different focus, at least for me, as a white male leader of privilege, she's been an amazing advisor and supporter, as we're trying to think about different ways to do a better job on race and equity. And I appreciate her mix of support and butt kicking as appropriate. So please join me in welcoming Elfrida Norman.
Well, thank you for that. I like the butt kicker part is especially nice for you to say, John. It's just been a pleasure working with you over the years. As the chair of the board of the Communities Foundation, and as John said, past chair of the Educate Texas Committee, and a proud supporter of Philanthropy Advocates. I kind of like that name. It's got a good ring to it. It's my pleasure to join you today, and I hope you've all had a good day. Just to recap some of the great highlights from today's agenda, hearing from former U.S. Secretaries of Education on the future of education in the COVID era, asking a really important question: how do we restart and reimagine education? I particularly heard in the discussion this notion of a COVID slide. I mean, that's something that we all had to, I think about and deal with. And I don't even think we've even realized what that is going to look like as we go forward, but we know it's going to be big. We heard from health policy experts about the intersection of health and education in light of COVID. Another really, intersection in which we're just beginning to understand. So more to come there. I particularly like the fact that we can watch this on demand on YouTube. So I didn't get a chance to hear everything fully. I'm going to go back and listen again. And that's a great idea. And for anyone that wasn't able to join those or hear those, you can go back. I think it's still going, right, for a little bit. We had the opportunity to preview the Educate Texas and the Philanthropy Advocates policy recommendations for 2021. And then again, these deep dives that we had in our breakout sessions. It feels like there's never enough time, right, to do this, and that time went really fast. So I'm really looking forward to reading the compilations, the road map going into 2021. One thing I do know is that we all have our work cut out for us in 2021, right? We're thinking 2020 is a bad year. We're going to have to buckle up for 2021. From my seat at the Dallas Reserve Bank, the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, the 2021 Texas legislative session is critical. It's a critical point for our state. Will the legislature fulfill the promise? As a state, will we stay on the path determined in 2019 with the historic school finance bill, House Bill 3, with their major investments in pre-K, teachers, college, career, and military readiness, the dual language? You know, the single thing that, well, right now we're all sort of thinking about November 3rd, right? Because we're all getting ready to vote, and as a country, we're geared up for that. But I think as a state, we're going to be really geared up for 2021 to see if we're going to make it to the other side. And we know it's around the budget. We heard, just looking at the deck today, $4.6 billion shortfall that has to be resolved in 2021. Will the legislature consider new revenue sources? Will they expand healthcare? If there's no new revenue considered, what reductions in current services will they choose? Will the federal government provide any relief for states through expanded extended use of CARES Act funding? This is going to be critical for schools. The good news is, and the question is, will the legislature have access to the Economic Stabilization Fund, which is a balance of $8.8 billion. If ever there was a rainy day, would this be it? A time, season? We'll see. But you know, the $1 million question, the $1 billion question is, will the legislature ensure the continued financial support of the reforms from House Bill 3? I think that's all. We're working on that. There are many other things, looking at the policy recommendations that we're looking at, but that really sort of is the center of it all. I'm thinking as we're going into 21. I'm encouraged by your commitment and value all of you for being members and key partners with us through Philanthropy Advocates. Philanthropy has a key role in the fulfillment of the promise. Whether it's funding research or data collection or providing external validation and support. It's hugely important, very important role. I miss Win Rosser. Feels kind of funny not hearing his voice, doesn't it? Sorry that he couldn't be with us today. Really appreciate his leadership as the chair of Philanthropy Advocates. I've enjoyed getting to know Win over the years. He's on our Educate Texas committee for the past couple of years, and I've also drafted him to be on a steering committee for me at the Federal Reserve on our Advanced Together steering committee. And also we're doing a little bit of work around this thing called digital inclusion. Another huge bit of work that we need to do. But I just wanted to just take the time, I know we're at the end of the day, but I wanted to thank you all and appreciate all that you're doing. And thank you for being with us and dedicating your time over these 2 days. Looking forward to seeing you hopefully in 2021 in person. Maybe we can hold on to that next time we do this, we will be in person again and maybe a little bit closer to normalcy. So anyway, I hope you all stay well and safe, and enjoy the rest of 2020 with your families, and try to de-stress as we get geared up for 2021 and the work that we need to do. So I will now pass the baton to Becky Callahan to preview the agenda for tomorrow.
Thanks, Elfrida. And I just want to echo what you said. We have a full day on Tuesday, and you just mentioned digital inclusion. We'll see Wynn actually on Friday to be able to talk about the digital divide. Your colleague, Elfrida Giordano Barton, is going to be with us as well. So for everyone on the call, thank you for being here. Day 2, like I said, it's full. We are going to have a Grantmaker coffee beginning at 8:30 a.m. This is for grantmakers only. We're going to talk together around how your grant making strategies and priorities have changed and how we all can support you. We'll be all together again. Everyone has the link for the broadband webinar. It'll be a similar format to what we saw this morning with the former secretaries of education. This one will be about the digital divide, and Wynn will be with us, our leadership committee chair. If you did not get a chance to see the on-demand video, you can find it in many of the emails you've gotten from us around the links, and it's also on our website. If you've had any technology issues, we certainly apologize, and thanks for bearing with us. We are going to come back together on Friday with the intention of smoothing out any of the troubles. So if you did have trouble, please contact me directly, and I will work with you to troubleshoot what happened, and we can fix that. And the last thing to say is Friday's agenda is on the website. It's on these slides as well, the Grantmaker Coffee, the broadband webinar, and we will also get to hear from legislators. We'll hear from 4 chairmen, Chairman Creighton of the Senate Higher Education Committee, Chairman Taylor of the Senate Education Committee, Chairman Huberty of the House Public Education Committee, and Chairman Capriglione of the House Appropriations Committee. This will be a meeting format. We'll get to engage and ask questions, so please come ready to listen to these legislators. And then we'll end the day with an election preview from Evan Smith of the Texas Tribune, and he will let us know what to predict for Tuesday as it's right around the corner, election day. So as always, please engage with us on social media, email us if you have any issues or questions, and thank you for attending. Have a great afternoon.